Hello, I am Michael Thompson, the Director of the Broader Impacts and Research Organization, if you are just now joining us for the third video, and welcome back if you have already watched the first and second video in the series. In this video, we will first talk about what the NSF BI criterion definition means at a conceptual, theoretical, rigorous level, and then a discussion on clarifying the difference between broader impacts and impacts. This will be followed by a brief discussion about the Broader Impacts Conceptual Framework, or BICF, and the basic structures of broader impacts. Lastly, we will discuss what broader impacts identity is and why it is critical for your success in broader impacts. So welcome to the new faculty NSF BI Workshop Seminar Series Overview, Part 3 on Conceptually Understanding BI through the Research and Scholarship of Broader Impacts. So let's specifically talk about conceptually understanding the term broader impacts and start moving that into NSF. So as you're very well aware, broader impacts is defined as encompassing the ability to benefit society and contribute to achievement of specific desired societal outcomes. But what does that mean? When I was starting as a researcher, I asked that same question. And it's important to understand as we start, and you probably saw this in the myths document, right, that broader impacts is really an international issue. It's not something that we're just thinking about here, it's something that we're really thinking about internationally. So you hear words about broader impacts as terms of relevance. You hear equity and development, that's in India. You hear about the research excellence framework, that's in the EU. You hear about responsible research and innovation. You hear societal impact. You hear value creation, you hear valorization in the Netherlands. All of these things are really moving towards how do you accomplish a broader impact. And a lot of those are within regards when we begin to talk about NSF is a broader impact through our research. What does broader impacts really mean? And how can we really begin to find out really exactly what and unpack that definition? In order to do that, what we did is we did a cross-case analysis of the broader impacts-like terms. So we begin to look at the responsible research and innovation, looking at that with Lass's work and comparing that to broader impacts. We begin to look at the research excellence framework. We begin to look at the valorization. All of those things, and looked at those to say, what do they, at their core basis, have in common? Because if all of them are broader impacts like broader impacts, we should be able to take that and streamline that down so that we can get a very good conceptual understanding of what this thing is at its core level. And so there was really three things that came out, and you can see that in the yellow, where it's something that's dealt with societally desirable, a process, and specific goals. After looking at all of those and putting things together, we get broader impacts, a global conceptual definition. Broader impacts is a process with stakeholders or people to achieve a specified goal that is societally beneficial in a finite time that's measured. Or we could use the one that Brown University uses, because there's quite a few other universities who are using global conceptual definitions, which is a process utilized by an entity or person to achieve a societal benefit in a finite measured amount of time, which is basically the same thing. So when we look at that and when we begin to say, okay, how does that compare with our NSF criteria definition, you have to realize outcomes has a finite time function. So outcomes, you can define outcomes as dealing with benefit, and it's a finite time function. Outcomes also have to be measured. So that's where you begin to see how those two things come together. Now, which specific desired societal outcomes is something that we begin to think about in terms of NSF, and we begin to look at those 1 through 9. But when we globally look at talking about broader impacts, we really can say that it's a process. We're going to have to deal with people or stakeholders. We're going to have to think about how we can strategically get to a certain goal. It's something that's society beneficial, and it's got to have a time function, which is the difference between impact and broader impact. When you think about impacts, because this is a question that we begin to ask when you're writing your NSF proposal, what's the difference between impact and broader impact? Impact can happen at any point in time. The fact that I touch the table, as you might know, is an impact. Does it mean that it's beneficial? Does it mean that it's positive? Does it mean that it's sustainable? It could happen in an infinite time. So you could end up and begin to talk about your research. And we'll use this because I hear this all the time in layman's term, to cure cancer, right? I mean, you hear that all the time. Well, that's an impact. There's not a specific time associated with it. It hasn't been planned, it's not strategic, and it's not looking for a high return on investment. Okay? Now, when we begin to talk about high return on investment and we begin to talk about this finite time function, you can then invoke this idea about taxpayers. You can invoke that. So if you're getting funding from NSF, a lot of that comes from taxpayers' dollars. Now, if you look at investors in general, if you're going to invest something, you want a high return on investment, but you don't want it to last in an infinite time frame. You want something that's tangible. You want something that you know is going to happen. You know that there's something that is specific. Herein lies the difference between when faculty begin to talk about that their research is going to do this without being specified, without being strategic, without working with someone, and without being societal beneficial. That distinguishes between the idea of impact and broader impact. You could have broader impacts and they will make sustainable impacts. They can build up to sustainable impacts. So you can see those 1 through 9 set of outcomes or goals that NSF have. What you're doing will eventually build into those things being sustainable. And that's how that works. If you look at the NSF criteria, the 1 through 9, and they talk about broadening participation, they talk about infrastructure, etc. When you begin to look at the sustainable impacts, those are on the outside of that ring. So how can what I do that's strategic, that's planned, working with others, that's beneficial in a finite amount of time, help me to build into something that's sustainable, or help NSF build into something that's sustainable? Let's talk a little bit about the structures in which to begin to really just to think about for writing, for evaluating, for organizing your thoughts. We already know that broader impacts, and you can look at the definition, NSF definition, you can think of the global conceptual definition, it's outcome-based. Now, when most faculty think about NSF broader impacts, the first thing that they think of is activities. What am I going to do? But really it's outcome-based, so you have to think about the benefits first. Within the structure, if we had to think about what are the structures of broader impacts, there's really 5. There's one that's called broader impacts identity. There's outcomes, there's outputs, activities, and there's inputs. And this is how we're going to really contextualize you being able to write your broader impacts, think about how you're going to begin to develop your broader impacts, begin to think about evaluating your broader impacts is with this. Now, what we need to ask ourselves, because what typically happens is that when it comes to NSF broader impacts or for broader impacts in general, most people think that's something that, well, I just have to do, that's NSF. This is something that I got to do for NSF, and so I'm going to figure out a group of activities and do it. Which, when you begin to really understand broader impacts, it's not by itself. You may be accomplishing broader impacts through what you're doing. It may not just be getting funded by NSF. So when you begin to ask, well, if I'm going to do broader impacts, if I'm going to begin to think about how I'm going to do NSF broader impacts successfully, there's something that's helping to guide how you're planning on accomplishing your broader impacts, what outcomes that you want to achieve. Because we know that broader impacts is outcome-based, not activities-based. And that's what we call broader impacts identity. And that's one of the reasons that we also gave you the FISAP, the Faculty Individual Strategic Assessment Profile, along with this 5-step development plan that's in your packet. Because if we could help you figure out what your broader impacts identity or your professional identity is, we can help you figure out which broader impacts would work best for you, since it's tied with your research. Now, there's a scholastic definition of broader impacts identity, there's a non-academic version, and basically, in general, broader impacts identity is who you are and how you plan to engage and benefit others by leaving a legacy through your research, teaching, occupation, and or service. And within your specific case, you're going to specifically be dealing with NSF, broader impacts and broader impacts through your research, and that's what you're very interested in doing. And we're going to cover a lot of this in the next different sessions because we need to help you develop a NSF broader impacts plan. but we're just covering a couple of the different pieces here. There's three parts that make up your broader impacts identity. There's your research, your teaching, or your service, something that we call society-centric, beneficial, engaged outcomes, and a legacy in addition to your field. So what do you want people to remember you by? How is what you're doing fitting in with the mission of the university? Because the mission of the university also has a benefit function. Now this is just an example, okay? And we're not going to go through every single detail, but this is a tenure track faculty about their broader impacts identity and how their things are integrated. And what they would do if they're focusing on NSF is take a piece of this and put that for a piece of a proposal and develop it out. So they know where they're planning on going. And part of the issue dealing with NSF broader impacts is figuring out what do you want to do and how does that work.